All right, so um, we will be in chapter 13, building off of what I had started with last time. Previously discussing the beast from the sea, the head that was wounded, the counterfeit resurrection experience, why that sort of experience would be happening. But one of the fascinating characteristics of Revelation is the subjects and the terms that it does not use, the people that it does not mention, the titles that it seems to kind of avoid. And one of those titles is the term the man of lawlessness. It does not refer by name to the king of the north. It does not refer to Antichrist at all, even though John was the one who used that term in both 1 John and 3 John. Or he never really uses that word Antichrist anywhere else in any other text. And of all texts, you would think that Revelation would be the one to use it. And as we discussed multiple times now, the beast and the image of what a beast represented and its function theologically represented more of a government, a nation, a history of nations, the governing kingdom over the world. But then it starts to narrow its focus, and it starts to speak more of an individual. And it's the structure that will help us understand why it's speaking the way it is, what John's intent and his design behind wording these things the way he does would be. But if you think in the broad context of history, we're not unfamiliar with the idea of world power, of world governments. Empires are generally found throughout history at a variety of different points. You can go all the way back to Egypt, which is one of the oldest of the world powers. And then, of course, you can follow after that with the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. You can go through history and see world powers. Even recently, you had Great Britain, which then, of course, began falling apart after you had multiple world wars. And now you could say that America is, generally speaking, the world power in some fashion or another. But there's been a lot of these examples throughout history, and in between those examples, you have nations vying for that power in that position, either by influence or war. But at the same time, as we see these things permeate history, there's another characteristic that kind of follows along with them, and that is that there's almost always a figurehead, a face to put to it. So, for example, in Egypt, you would have Pharaoh. In Greece, you would have had someone like Alexander the Great. In Persia, you had Cyrus the Great. In Babylon, you had Nebuchadnezzar. In Rome, you would have had Caesar. In Britain, you would have had the king. In Germany, in Nazi Germany, you would have had Adolf Hitler. And then, of course, in America, we have a long history of figureheads. One of the unique characteristics of the U.S. president, for example, is that he is the figurehead of the most powerful nation in the world. You could go all the way back to George Washington and work your way all the way through up, and most people have heard of or are familiar with at least one or more of the presidents. And all of that to say that for all of the reach of a government and a kingdom and how necessary it is for that sort of an empire to have a standing army and victories and successes and so on, there's always a guy at the top. There's always a face to ascribe to it. It's never a collective kingdom at the end of the day. Someone will stand out. And we have figures throughout history that I just mentioned, and we're used to this idea, but not only are we used to it, the world craves this sort of thing. We have a small slice or an example of this in the history of Israel, where God had led them out of Egypt, brought them into their land, and he would be the one ruling over them. But they eventually became discontented with this idea, and they went over and began complaining. And of course, we have the whole account there with Samuel and them coming and saying, we want to be like the other nations. We also want a king. We also want a figurehead to follow. And so God gave them Saul, and we know how that worked out. But this is normal and intrinsic to human behavior to want a person to follow, a face to put to a cause. And you see this in not only history, but you see this every day. People either want someone to blame, but at the same time, they also want someone to follow, someone to credit, someone to trust. And so this permeates history. It is built into human nature, and people are normalized into looking for that sort of a person. Behind every cause, behind every social endeavor, behind every radical change, there will almost always be a person to tie to it, whether infamously or famously. And so humanity craves this sort of a thing. They crave a person to follow. Satan has undoubtedly utilized this longing to possess such a man to accomplish a goal, and not simply in the future. I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that he's done this throughout history. Daniel 10 alludes to this concept that there were more than just kings behind the power at the time. There were spirits, there were powers and principalities behind the scenes that Paul alludes to that were at work influencing people like this. And so it's not abnormal for us to understand that the devil would use people. There was a biography written at some point, and I'm borrowing this example from another preacher speaking on the same subject, and he was speaking about Adolf Hitler and how, for all of his seeming charisma at the beginning, as time went on, he became increasingly paranoid and increasingly almost schizophrenic / bipolar. I mean, the guy was rather incoherent, but at the same time very dangerous, at points even in the middle of the night yelling at people who weren't there. And so this concept, I think, is not limited purely to the Old Testament. I think we can find examples of this in the New. Even as in being discussed in the Gospels, Jesus casting out demons was not merely, it was not some metaphor, it was a real thing. Spiritual beings, demons and angels are real things, and they have an effect on the world. And so, here we understand this concept of spiritual warfare. We understand that as much as heaven is a real place and as much as hell is a real place, so are the beings that inhabit it. And yet here we find them kind of narrowing down to a point in time and to a person. So Satan undoubtedly utilized this longing. He is referred, or Paul refers to the spirit of disobedience, which is at work in the world, with powers and principalities behind the curtain, pulling the strings of those leaders that we see. While we know Satan is not omnipresent, nor is he omniscient, he nevertheless runs around the world, enforcing his influence across the nations and their leadership, as he has done throughout history. So, on the one hand, he is called at one point the ruler of this world. He is at the end of the day, the guy who kind of drives the nations to their rebellion. We see that effect when he is taken away. So after Christ returns and the millennial kingdom begins, Satan is taken out of the picture, and what happens to the nations, even the secular nations? They just kind of go neutral. They're not necessarily suddenly saved, but they're no longer rebelling. They're just kind of being subjected to the reign of Christ. And you might say, well, that's because Jesus is the one ruling over them. Except at the end of the 1,000 years, when Satan is released, what's the first thing they do? He gathers them together and they go again. So we understand that there is more to what we see in the news and the world and throughout history than just people making political decisions. Satan even does this with not only rulers, but he does this with individuals. But at the same time, he's limited. He can't be everywhere all at once. He can't snap his fingers and make everyone act like zombies and do whatever he says. That's not how it works. He still has to exert his influence. He is still a deceiver. He is still active in how he talks to and how he works out his plan. He has to scheme. He has to plan. He has to plot. And he has to move the pieces. But we also see that he possessed Judas Iscariot in particular, after trying and failing to enter Peter during the Last Supper, after Judas has been narrowed down as the son of perdition, as the one who would betray the Christ. We then see Jesus speaking to Peter, and he says the devil is also asking to sift you. He's asking to test you as well. And so Peter obviously is spared from the same fate as Judas, but we can see a general pattern here. In fact, I think I've alluded to this last time, we're not really aware that I can think of in the context of the New or Old Testament of Satan himself possessing a person other than Judas Iscariot. I'm not aware of any part where it specifically names the devil as being the cause behind it. He possessed Judas in this way, accomplishing his purpose of having Christ betrayed into the hands of sinful men to be killed. For this very reason, Judas was given the title Son of Perdition, or Son of Destruction, and was called a devil by Christ in John 6:70. So Jesus already looking ahead to what was going to happen when Peter gives his famous, where else, Lord, to whom else shall we go? You have the words of life. And then Jesus, of course, responds, even though I've been with you this whole time, yet is not one of you a devil. And so he's already looking ahead at Judas Iscariot and what he would do. Judas having been destined to fulfill that purpose which was determined by God, with the devil being a pawn in God's ultimate plan. And now, in this context of Revelation 13, the devil seeks to enter a man one last time, giving that title, the son of destruction, to one last human through whom he intends to influence the world to lead a charge against the woman Israel. And so he's making one last effort, one last push to gather everything he can. And we know the context of why he's doing this. He's just been cast out of heaven. He knows his time is short. He is moving quickly. And so he starts to begin his effort. As the devil offered Jesus in the wilderness to give him all the kingdoms of the earth, now we see him doing just that with this particular man. Jesus obviously goes out in the wilderness to be tested, and after 40 days of not eating, the devil comes along and begins to tempt him, and one of the things he offers to Jesus is that he would give him all the kingdoms of the earth if he would just bow down and worship him. And of course, we know how that played out, that Jesus denies this, rejects it, counters him, but you could see what Satan was trying to do. He was trying to say, look, I can make it happen, and I can give you all these kingdoms, whether that was the immediate kingdom of Israel or working your way out to Rome as an empire or any other. I'll give them all to you. And there is a small grain of truth to that. Obviously, Satan is not God. He cannot control everything. But at the same time, we, as I mentioned earlier, see his influence throughout the world. Here, he appears to offer the exact same thing to this man who takes him up on that offer. And then we see, as it were, how it would have played out in the time of Christ, but now how it's playing out here. That having offered to give him the kingdoms of the world, the man accepts it, and now the devil goes to work subjecting them. In this man, or it is this man, whom the world will follow as their last figurehead of leadership. He may even compare himself to great leaders of the past. Now, we certainly see references to great leaders in Daniel's prophecies. We see them looking forward. But we see people like Cyrus the Great or Artaxerxes or Alexander the Great or others being referenced. And so this man may look on himself as not only being like them, he may even think in some peripheral sense of that statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, where Nebuchadnezzar was the golden head at the top, the greatest form of world leadership that would exist. And this man may treat that as competition. He may view himself as greater than Nebuchadnezzar, and I think there's more than one reason to think that. But he'll think himself to be the greatest leader to have ever lived. This will be the last great man who the world will follow, whether willfully or not, as he is going to be given authority to subject both the nations and the saints to his power. He will not only desire to sit at the head of the world, he will be given that position. He will not be denied his place in history, and he will strive to be the greatest king the world has ever seen, being promoted to the head of the most powerful government the devil can conjure up over an earth more populated than it has ever been. This will be an unprecedented, incomparable, and undefeatable system that's established here, and this guy will be placed at the head. Like the kings of old, he will subject any and all opposition to himself and will force his declared sovereignty over the nations and their kings as he sits on the throne of the world. He will be like Alexander the Great, rising from the lowly to the highest position, and will conquer the nations around him in an unstoppable campaign. It may be hindered by the nations and their rulers, but only temporarily. He will rule over a fake representative government which proposes to be a kingdom of multiple leaders, yet he will sit above them all, like Caesar, who gained power in a temporary position in a time of war, only to rule much longer than otherwise would have been allowed. There's one of the history behind characters like Caesar, who initially started up in what would have been seen in some form as a representative republic of Rome, and the idea that they had senators, they had representatives from different areas. And so Caesar was given temporary power. They had a certain provision that in certain existential crises, they could appoint one man to be in charge. It was a matter of governmental efficiency. Rather than going through all the bureaucratical red tape, you could give all the power, the keys to the kingdom and the military to one guy, and then he would have that for a little bit. And then when the crisis came to an end, you could take that power away. It's kind of like emergency powers or martial law, as we would see it today. But Caesar, who rose to his position in part because of that, never really gave it up. And so then you had the appearance of a republic, but in practice, it was more of a single man running the whole show. And so this man will view himself in a similar fashion. And, like Hitler, he will specifically target the Jews, especially Zion, though not at first, as he must complete a successful and deceptive sequence of events to lead them along to their own destruction. So he will have harbored in the back of his thoughts the desire to destroy Israel, because that is the woman that his father, the devil, has been trying to destroy. But he can't start that way. He needs to lead them along before he gets there, which we'll explain in a minute. He will be great in power, in effect, and in boasting, declaring himself greater than all of the kings who preceded him, and exalting himself to the place of godship, ultimately sitting in the very temple of God and declaring himself to be the God of the Bible. And he will rule the world through force and subjection and worship, but only for a time and not without opposition. So this is what it's leading to. But now we're going to look at the text and see how it explains this character. Because this text says little, and yet it says a lot. So in Revelation chapter 13, starting at verse 1, "And I saw the dragon who stood on the sand of the seashore. And then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet like that of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed, and followed after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?'" Now, chronologically, what we've just seen is the rise of this governing power. We've not yet narrowed ourselves down to the individual. We're working our way down there. But again, beast, consistently with Daniel, is more representative of a governing body, of a kingdom, made up of different ways and in different rulers and history, but that's the idea here. And so, to this point, Satan has given his power and his authority. He has given the power of the nations to this kingdom, and this kingdom has 10 rulers. However, as the world is in awe of this, we then get to verse 5. "And there was given to him a mouth, speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven." So, he's given a mouth. Now, this seems like on its surface level, a really strange idea. You already had the beast. You already described as having the mouth of a lion. So what's happening here? What is this meant to represent? In verse 2, the beast is seen as having the mouth of a lion, and this describes the beast prior to the event where the head appears slain and resurrected. So basically, to kind of try to sum up a lot in a sentence or two, the idea is that you had the history of these different kingdoms seen in Daniel 7. They've all been combined into this one last thing, and the mouthpiece of that nation, as it first comes together, will be whatever nation the lion was. It's kind of the idea. So seeing the mouth in verse 2, it is seen as the mouth of a lion, and this is certainly tied to Daniel 7:4. And in that context, the lion is seen as a separate nation. It is not yet combined into this bigger one, and that appears to be a reference to Babylon. And so you have the kingdom of Babylon seen there initially, and now it is combined in this new one as the mouth. With that in mind, it likely means that the mouth seen in Revelation 13:2 is speaking of the nation, that is Babylon, acting as the voice of the government being created here. In other words, the decrees issued by this government emanate from the nation of the lion. It is also possible that this points to the origins of the man of lawlessness, indicating that he arises from that nation as well. This could be possible considering Isaiah 14. And in Isaiah 14, there is a rebuke given to what it calls the king of Babylon. That is the one who exalts himself to be God and to ascend into heaven of his own effort. And so it calls him there the king of Babylon. So it may be a reference in that way. This makes further sense when you recall how Babylon is explained and described in Revelation 17 and 18. Because there, it's not even necessarily called a nation. It narrows down the scope, initially to a woman riding the beast, but then we're given the title of the woman and then described its downfall in the next chapter. It narrows down Babylon not as a kingdom that's ruling the world now, but as a city, as the great city, as the big city that it calls Babylon. And so it would make sense, then, in this way. In effect, this means that a city called Babylon will appear, or a city will be renamed, though the nature of that name is still up for debate. The word mystery is used right before the name or the title is given, so we'll get to that when we get to it, but this is the idea, generally speaking. The city will be the center of the world's economy, as described by its downfall in Revelation 18, where the merchants of the world and the kings of the world and the shipmen of the world all lament her downfall because this is where everyone was prospering. Therefore, its place as the mouth of the beast is fitting, indicating that it will be a sort of de facto capital of this new world power, that this is where all of the decrees and all of the ordinances and laws and prosperity will be coming from. However, that capital will act as the mouth of the beast temporarily, as a new mouth is about to be given after the head appears to be slain and then resurrected. And it's an interesting word that's used here. If you note, he doesn't say, and he seizes these things. He does not seize authority to act for 42 months. He does not take power with his mouth. All of these things are given to him. He is given authority and a throne and a kingdom. He is given a mouth uttering great boasts, and he is given the authority to act for 42 months. So he's given these things. He doesn't simply seize them. This is the same word used when the dragon gives his authority. The word is used repeatedly here to clarify that the beast does not seize this power away from the devil, nor does he force his way to the top, but rather he is given the power by the devil. In other words, his rise is explained not by the acceptance nor the influence of the world and its nations, but rather the ruler of this world, who is the dragon, gives his power and the position, regardless of the world's acceptance or willingness. These will fall into line one way or another. And this matters in the sense that what we might think, and what I think has been a common misconception, you see it even, say, on the Left Behind series, where this guy just shows up one day and everyone just magically falls into line and they all just love the guy and they all just kind of go along. But that's not necessarily how either this text or Daniel describes the events. They follow along, some do in adoration and willingness, but a lot of them have to be beaten into submission. He conquers. He is seen as going out and kind of forcing everyone into line. Now, the way he is able to do that is because all of the other nations are, shall we say, unassisted by Satan at this point. Satan has now given all power and all of his authority that he has to give over to this kingdom, and no one will be able to stop it. That's why it is given to him. It is handed to him by the devil. But as with any world power, it also is now given a figurehead. This man will be the personification of the kingdom, being the face attached to the nation and the person at the head of it. His rise will follow the peak of the beast's power, and as will his downfall accompany the death of the beast. Even Christ will be the face of the 1,000-year kingdom. It's oddly enough, again, another parallel, that with the 1,000-year reign, it is that of Christ. Jesus will be the head of it. He will be the figurehead. He will be the face. He will be the name tied to it. And there we see Christ himself being the very essence and core of the kingdom and his reign over the earth. You cannot have one without the other. This will be a fitting comparison because this is a counterfeit kingdom run by Satan. So as we discussed last time, when the head is slain, it appears as if slain. The wording, as I talked about before, is a slight variation of the same wording used to the lamb seen in Revelation 5, where there the lamb was slain, he had been killed, and was now standing alive. But here we see the head looks like it's been slain. Everyone is convinced that it has been killed, but he's actually not. It's a ruse. It is a counterfeit. And then as a result, he looks like he's been raised from the dead. This is in keeping with a counterfeit Christ. This is in keeping with a counterfeit resurrection. And now we are looking at the counterfeit kingdom. And now we're going to zero in even more into that kingdom at the counterfeit king of the kingdom. So the beast is given the mouth by an outside influence. It's pretty safe to say the answer to this question, who is the one giving the mouth? Well, that technically is the dragon. In other words, this man will be personally selected by the devil to speak on behalf of the kingdom. As he gave the beast its power, so too will he give the man to speak for the beast. So he has been working on this structured government for a while. He calls it up from the sea because he knows his time is short. He turns it on, gets it going, moves it along, and now is going to assign a man to run it. When? When does this mouth show up? At what point do we expect to see this man? It will happen when the beast has come into its full power and is starting to begin its 42-month reign. In other words, it does not have its power, it does not act on this authority, it can't, until the mouth is given to it. And that lasts for 42 months. This event follows immediately after the fake killing and resurrection of the head. And it is likely that this event is tied to the man himself, as I spoke about before, where a head generally represents a kingdom, but inasmuch as you have a figurehead of a kingdom, it may also be tied to the man. And so I think that effectively you have this false resurrection tied to this man who will act as the mouth. Will work in tandem. Meaning that the result of this counterfeit resurrection event will be the revelation of the man of lawlessness as the mouth. Why? Why does he need to be given a mouth? Why go through all of this process? As previously stated, this is to put not only a face to the beast, but a person who can speak. We see no indication that the dragon speaks to the nations, nor does the beast speak directly. Rather, we see the man of lawlessness act as the person who does the talking, and this is in keeping with that apparent and consistent theme of a counterfeit trinity, where we see the man of lawlessness appear as the embodiment of the enemy, but as a man possessed rather than Christ himself. So you have the dragon who acts as the father of lies. You have the son, as it were, the fleshly visualization of this, in this case as the man of lawlessness, and then you have the spirit, which is the spirit of Antichrist. As a technical detail, which head? Which head are we talking about? So a mouth is given to the beast. On which head is it given? Almost certainly the one that had been slain. This false resurrection event will be so impactful that it will result in a new individual, one man, being elevated to the highest place of power in the world. There are no other mouths mentioned beyond this point, meaning that this one is the one which speaks for a beast as a whole. The other 10 kings are pushed aside. There's a lot of particulars you could look at there, but in a sort of basic summary, you have this new world power that suddenly shows up. It's sold as one thing, but manifests as another thing, and then this guy is brought to the head of it, and now it's unstoppable. But now we get to the mouth itself, to the man, because we've been focused on this governing kingdom, this entity that is this beast which rules the world, and it is in effect the thing that will run it, but it is tied at the very top to one man and one man alone. We call him the man of lawlessness. He's the king of the north. He is also called the king of Babylon, and it is narrowed down to this one mouth. Now, to the person who has never read eschatology before, they may look at this and kind of fly past it. All right, there's given a mouth, uttering arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority is given to act for 42 months, and then you kind of move on. The mouth isn't mentioned again. But, as we've talked about, and we're going to go through some texts again that we've gone through before, this should sound very, very familiar. This mouth is to be narrowed down to one man, especially when we take into consideration Daniel's visions concerning these things. So I'll read through these, starting all the way back in Daniel 7. I mean, if you think about the history, where does this man first appear in the Bible? We know Christ is first originally referenced in Genesis as the seed which will deal with the serpent. And then Christ would be alluded to from there. But where does this guy show up for the first time? Technically, his first reference would be in Isaiah 14, and we will get to that one soon. But in Isaiah 14, there is description of the king of Babylon, but he does something rather unique, and his downfall is catastrophic. But the first real specific title or reference that were given to this man shows up in Daniel chapter 7. Starting at verse 7, speaking of the fourth beast, after this I looked in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth, and it devoured and crushed and trampled down the others with its feet. And it was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Right? So we've gotten to this point now in Revelation. And while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and the 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. The idea, again, being that it's like a tooth growing up. As he grows, he pushes out 3 others. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Now, we're tying these two together. If you go down to verse 11, then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. And I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. And then Daniel asks for explanation. He asks for clarification. In fact, he kind of zeroes his focus in on that horn. He asks down in verse 20, for the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great boasts, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. In other words, it started small, and now it's grown. I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, which is what we'll cover soon in the same chapter, because in Revelation 13, and authority was given to this mouth, and he wars against the saints. So we're seeing the same person here. But then in verse 24, it's explained further. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them. And he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. And he will speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the Highest One, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time, which translates to 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. Again, it's the same period of time that he's alluding to here. So we're talking about the same guy here. But we're given even more clarity in the very next chapter, in Daniel chapter 8. All the way down at verse 9, we see a different beast. So he's kind of zeroed in on another point, in our case, history. And he looks at what I believe to be a visualization of what was coming in the kingdom of Greece with Alexander the Great, who kind of shows up, defeats the Medes and the Persians, and in the peak of his power, he suddenly is found dead, and his kingdom is split between 4 of his generals, and it goes 4 different directions. And alluding to one of those directions in verse 9, it says, out of one of them came a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down, and it even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. And it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn, along with the regular sacrifice, and he will fling truth to the ground and prosper and perform his will. And then later down in the same chapter, he's given an explanation. In verse 23, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. In other words, it is given to him. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, and prosper, and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. The vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. He's looking ahead. In that text, we are given insight into his personal history, into the characteristics which start with him. He starts small. He grows exceedingly great. He elevates himself so highly that he is seen growing into heaven, causing some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and tramples them, and makes himself equal with God, and removes the regular sacrifice. And if you've been paying attention for the years that I've been speaking on this, that phrase, that event, removing the regular sacrifice, is paramount to understanding at what point Daniel is seeing this. This is the event that happens when they begin to set up the abomination of desolation, and it will be 1,290 days from that moment, when he cuts off the regular sacrifice, that the abomination of desolation will be seen, and the man of lawlessness is revealed. So he's being very specific as to who he's looking at here. But then he doesn't even stop there. If we go all the way over to Daniel 11, we now get an even more specific, detailed look at this guy's history. In Daniel 11, down at verse 21, speaking of a prior king, in his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in a time of tranquility and will seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor their ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. And then he goes on and stirs up his strength against the king of the south, and there's a campaign of deception. And then, of course, we go all the way down to verse 31, where something has happened. He's become frustrated and disheartened. And in verse 31, forces from him will arise, will desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and, there it is again, will do away with the regular sacrifice, and then they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. And then down in verse 36, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done, and he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show any regard for any other god. And people have speculated as to why it's phrased this way. Maybe he's a homosexual, maybe he's celibate. That's not the idea here. It's not telling you his relationship status other than his relationship with himself. This man, no matter what other relationships he has, he is paramount, he is preeminent, he stands above them all, because it's summed up in that last part. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, nor for the desire of women, nor for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. Instead, he will honor a god of forces or fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. And he will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. And he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will give them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. And then it goes on, and again, I've spent time in that one, and I can spend a lot more time on that one. But you can see the general theme, the consistent theme that's showing up here. This guy is not only full of himself, he is very full of himself, but he has success to back it. And so, with all of these things, especially in that phrase where then the king will do as he pleases and magnify himself, the same idea given in Daniel 7, in Daniel 8, and in Daniel 11, even in Isaiah 14, where he magnifies himself to be equal with God or greater than God or equivalent with God. It ultimately ties there in 2 Thessalonians 2, which we've read many times. The man of lawlessness will appear in tandem with the apostasy and will sit in the temple of God and declare himself to be God. We're looking at the same God, or the same guy here who thinks he is God. So these texts help us to clarify the identity of this mouth as a direct reference to what we would call the 11th horn, the little horn that grows into the big horn, the last king, the king of the north, called the king of Babylon, the man of lawlessness. All of these titles pointing towards one man who will be given his authority to rule the world for a time, and at times, and a half a time, 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days. It is a very specific amount of time. So not only has the devil, the dragon, set up this governing kingdom, he is giving all of his authority, he is allocating all resource, all attention, all subjection under this nation, but now he is giving all that authority through that body, through that nation, to one man, and that man is his man. The actions of this man will not only reflect the same sins of the beast, but will also explain why the beast does what he does, including things like regulating currency, when we get down to the mark of the beast, and how he regulates the economy, and how he forces people to worship him by preventing their ability to buy and sell, which we'll get into later. And so we can fill in the exact nature of this mouth and this figurehead by combining everything we know into this. And so, we now have identified the man. We've started with the beast, or the dragon. We worked our way down to the beast. We worked down to the function of the beast, and the history, and the reign, and the rule, and the authority, and the length of time. And now we've zeroed in on the mouth, and now we can zero in on his arrogance. The NASB translates it as, and the mouth was speaking arrogant words. But there's a better way to phrase it. That is implied in the word. But literally, and it was given to it a mouth talking great. And the word great comes from the Greek word we've mentioned before. So we had a great dragon, a great sign, and great authority. And the idea is from the Greek word mega, or large. It is massive. So the idea here is clear, that the mouth speaks mega things. It does not speak small, nor does it speak insignificant, but rather everything which comes from the mouth is loud and excessive, as one who brags without shame nor restraint. Another way to view this is that the mouth here is speaking wide, which may include hyperbolic language. Combined with what we're told in Daniel, this man may be speaking either of things which he genuinely believes to be true, such as his own greatness, or as a means to deceive, which it would be referenced when it talks about his deceptive work there in Daniel, and by using smooth words and skillful intrigue. He still, even in doing those things in his deception, still uses large, hyperbolic, excessive language. Everything is great. It is what characterizes how the mouth speaks. There is no reference that I could find, that I could think of, where this man is described as humble or quiet. Every reference to him is in this sense. He is boastful. He speaks loud, and he magnifies himself. Another translation would be that he is speaking arrogantly, which is fitting with one who will magnify himself to be God. But the wording is not simply limited to arrogance, but also in his dialogue, his plans, and his schemes. This guy, this mouth will do nothing small. It's not as he views it. And this character of boasting is one which grows. He does not start as equating himself to be God. He grows into that position. Again, the horn starts small and grows exceedingly great. He does not begin as one magnifying himself equal with God, although he almost certainly views himself quite highly, a character trait which will drive him to such a blasphemous conclusion. And we would expect to see that characteristic in his life prior to this, though we are not told to what extent, if at all, he tries to hide it. Again, the only character trait we are aware of this man in this regards is that he speaks great things. That's just how he talks. At no point are words like humility and quiet used, indicating that he likely does not hide it the majority of the time. However, he is also characterized as being deceptive. So he does not merely speak great of himself, but through smooth words and intrigue and political capability, he speaks great things of the people who follow him, alluded there in Daniel 11, that he endorses anyone who comes along with him. And they also are great. Not as great as him, but they are great. And so he endorses and flatters people who come with him. As we've seen in Daniel 11, some, if not many, will believe that he has every right. Because this is what makes this man so interesting. If you had run into a person in the public who just always bragged of himself, there was no thing that he did in life that was small or insignificant, you think, whatever, I don't know what that guy's on, he can go away. But this man has something else. It's not all empty boasting. It's not without merit. Because, as was alluded to, and as is going to be seen here, he has great successes. This man is almost always victorious in efforts. He is hindered, he is slowed down, he has to use deception to work his way to the top, but he doesn't ultimately fail. He will always eventually get what he's looking for. And so the people look on at this and think that he has every right to boast of himself, as he will have a resume of victories going so far as to do what his fathers and his fathers' fathers have not done. His actions will be generally characterized by a great deal of successes. In fact, his victories are seen as unprecedented. Again, doing things nobody else before him has done. Giving more credence to his claims of his own greatness. His deception will be, in part, based on the fact that he is actually pretty great and victorious. He actually has things in his resume to back his claims. Being very successful in his endeavors, especially when no one else would have been able to accomplish such things. These victories will bring more people under his influence, as they will see him to be worthy of such praise. And so he is bringing himself up to the top, and he has no problem telling you about it. That is the characteristic of this man. Every text I can find of this man, whether it is describing his actions or even his condemnation and his downfall, is tied around his arrogance, his self-centered boasting. And here we see it described as a mouth. That man who is so arrogant, who is so boastful, and is also very successful, is almost an unstoppable force, is the one that the devil will pick as the mouth for the beast. This will be the figurehead. But he does not stop at arrogance. He does not stop at boasting of himself. Again, if we look all the way back at Revelation 13, there's another word in here. There was given to him a mouth speaking great words, great things, and blasphemies. And then in verse 6, and he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So he will exceedingly magnify himself. He will grow in his ego, in his perception of himself and his successes. We see hints of this with, again, empires of the past. This is not a new thing. People who began to view themselves as unusually successful, and they let it get to their heads, and they began to think, maybe I am a god, maybe I am all that. We even see Nebuchadnezzar fall to the same peril, that on one day, even after being warned that it was coming, he goes up on his balcony, looks out over everything and says, wow, look what I have done. And then his mind is turned to that of an animal. He goes out into the field, and he's out there for a bit of time before he finally comes to and realizes, no, this was given to me, in his case, by God. And so he goes farther than mere arrogance, this man. Where Nebuchadnezzar was driven into fields as an animal because he failed to give God glory for his achievements, that man did not ultimately claim by the end of it to be God. He thought initially he was a god, but eventually he became fascinated with the God of Daniel and began hearing him and then coming around. And I think by the end of his life, Nebuchadnezzar had been properly turned around. But this man does not do that. Here, we see a man who has many successes, credits himself for those successes, and then proceeds to elevate himself to actually being God, and the way he does that is worse than any other person in history. Where the Romans came and ransacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, in history, people like the Greeks had gone into the temple and reportedly offered a pig on the altar. As bad as those things were, this man will take one step farther. He will walk into the temple, he will sit down in the temple, and he will declare himself to be the God that that temple represents. This is all clearly tied to the activity surrounding the abomination of desolation. We know from our cross-references, along with Matthew 24, that this man will become so arrogant that he will begin to consider his standing before God as something to be challenged. Maybe at the beginning he credits God with giving him this. When he ultimately forgoes the gods of his fathers, he does that towards the end of his little pathway there. And so, despite deception, maybe he tries to, in some way, feign humility by giving credit to the gods of his fathers, potentially. But he won't stay there. It does not start with his claim to deity, but that does happen now. We therefore assume that his fathers had a god or gods that they followed, which he himself will eventually put aside when he magnifies himself. This indicates that he may, at best, feign observance to that god for a time, but his ultimate object of worship is himself, and the only god that he worships is seen there in Daniel 11. He will worship a god of, as it's translated in the NASB, fortresses, but the literal wording is the god of force, the god of, you could say, the ability to exhort his will. The size and scale of a fortress could represent power, that it was defensible, that it was insurmountable. This guy worships a god of his ability to exert force, because he himself views himself to be so great in that he is a god, and the nation that he rules is so powerful that he begins to worship the idea of acting on that power. That is, he worships the ability to reach and impart his own will on any person in any place at any time. He worships power, and he worships the ability to effect it. So the basic sequence of events, as far as I understand it and have seen to this date, will be generally as follows. He will rise during a time of peace, or as Daniel 11 calls it, a time of tranquility. In other words, the nation that he's rising in is not really in any sort of conflict. It's considered generally peaceful as it pertains to his nation, and he will prosper his way to the top, overwhelming and pushing aside any opposition. The wording, I think, implies that he comes from, or at the very least, rises through what he calls the richest parts of the realm. He rises through the ranks of the ones who were before him, the prior rulers of the nation, and he drives through them, rides through their ranks, and goes above them. And so it's a tale as old as time. You have, either some guy from poverty or some guy who represents the people from poverty and works his way past all the greedy people at the top, and then when he gets to the top, then it's finally fair with them. That's the idea, anyway. He will succeed in his power and his influence, appearing to gather even gather the support of those who view themselves as poor or afflicted by the prior authorities which preceded him. And he distributes plunder, which comes from the richest parts of the realm, and gives it to those outside that realm. He will take power as the leader of the nation, though he will not be recognized as king by the authorities which precede him. The honor of kingship is not conferred. So while he technically sits in the place and will exert his will as a king, they do not give him the honor of kingship. They do not call him or recognize him as a king. Nevertheless, he will reign as the ruler, eventually receiving the title of king anyway. He starts getting called later down in the chapter the king. So at some point he gets what he wants. He will then go to war with another region or nation, known to us only as the South, wherein he will have multiple victories while the opponent will lose. Even though the opponent originally outnumbers him, he is betrayed by his own. These will sign a peace deal for a time, or as it describes, they will sit at a negotiating table. And they will do that for a time, though with deception still in effect even at the negotiating table. So while they sit down to draw some sort of deal, they're still deceiving each other even there. He will also make a stop through Israel, the beautiful land as it is referenced in Daniel, and will make some sort of action apparent, though we're not told what it is. He does something there, though Daniel does not tell us what it is that he does. And then he will also pass through Egypt, again, for some unknown reason. He seems to do something with the wealth of Egypt, and he kind of stops in there and then moves along. But then he will attempt to go against the south again. However, this time it describes ships from Cyprus coming along and disheartening him. Now, geographically, if you look at that area with Israel in the middle, and you have, today you would look at Iraq up to the north, Iran up to the north east, you have beneath it down to the southwest, Egypt, and then, of course, you have Lebanon and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, all these nations. If you look at that region, Israel sits on the shorelines of what was called the Mediterranean today, or in Daniel's day was called the Great Sea. And so the Mediterranean kind of goes out towards the west. But if you were to try to go, like Paul, for example, in his missionary journeys, from Israel, and you wanted to go purely by sea all the way up to, say, Rome, you might find yourself taking a stop at an island that we call today Cyprus, a little island in the middle of the Mediterranean, before then making your way on. In the ancient days, Cyprus was called Kitim, and this is the place that these ships seem to originate from or come around from. Now, we're not told why he is disheartened by these. He is on his way to go to war again with the king of the south. He clearly loves the fact that it worked before, so he figures, let's try again. But for some reason, ships from that area, either from Cyprus directly or from the direction that is the Mediterranean from the west, come along, and the NASB translates it as disheartens, but the Greek kind of, I think, narrows it down even more. In the Septuagint, he's humiliated. For some reason, he does not go to war with whoever these ships belong to. But he hates that fact. He is enraged. It makes him furious because it humiliates him. He has to take this force that originally was so effective and pull it back. Again, we're not told why. Just something about this event makes him have to pull back. But what's even stranger about this is that he doesn't go to war with Cyprus. He doesn't go to war with the West. He is enraged because of these ships and becomes enraged at what Daniel calls the Holy Covenant. He aims at Israel for some reason. And it is from that event that he then orders forces to go into Jerusalem and to begin to set up the abomination by removing the regular sacrifice. I don't know why that particular event is framed the way it is, other than that is how Daniel 11 frames it. And so, in other words, his character, being so full of himself, being so sure of his power and his victory and his guaranteed success, and this is prior to him declaring himself to be God, by the way. That's about to happen. But in this moment, he thinks he's about to have a guaranteed victory again, and then he is humiliated, and we see by character that this is not the guy to humiliate, because he takes action. And boy, does he take action. I mean, he proceeds not only to go and set up the abomination of desolation, it is after that he will then go and declare himself to be God, and then, as Daniel 11 describes even farther down, he will then go to war with other places. He'll go to war again, this time with a nation farther north. He will go to war with the south, and he will subject all the nations under himself. And so this is the action that he takes, but in this context, he attempts to go up against them. Ships from Cyprus dishearten and humiliate them. This causes him to begin the process of setting up the abomination of desolation. And this event, where it is set up, where he begins to send the forces and they go to begin to get everything ready, is the event that Jesus references in Matthew 24:15, where when those who are in Judea see the abomination in the holy place where it ought not be, when you see it, when they have set it up, get out of town. Flee to the mountains. Don't look back. You don't have much time, because the man of lawlessness is on his way. And shortly after the abomination of desolation is set up, based on Matthew 24, very shortly after it is set up, or at least seen to be set up, where the temple has been readied for the man to enter, he will then appear and enter into the temple and sit himself down. This is, in my opinion, seen as follows, because if you think about, and I've said this before, but if you think about the temple, how it's structured, how it's ordered, what furniture is in the temple, you know that there's the holy place, and then in there is the Holy of Holies, and in that area of the temple, generally speaking, there was only one chair. There was only one seat, which was the Ark of the Covenant, which was also known as the mercy seat. And so I'm quite convinced that what this man will do is sit himself on that seat, on the ark, and this really makes it unavoidable as to what he's claiming to be. He's not claiming to be a God. He's not claiming to be a different God. He is claiming to be the God of that temple, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. He has narrowed down his focus. It's kind of similar to when the Israelites, after Moses wouldn't come down, they went and built a golden calf, and they didn't say, behold, a different God. They said, behold, the God who took you out of Egypt. Here, this man does this himself. And this is the moment that Paul points to, along with the apostasy, which is the event which officially begins the Great Tribulation. Now, in case this man seems scary or intimidating, there is an irony here. And that's the timing. He does not do this thing where he sits in the temple of God at the peak of being undefeated. He actually does this as a response to humiliation, to not being able to win. It's an interesting flow of thought because in Daniel 11, he's just constantly winning. He's constantly growing. And then the one time he is not able to do what he wants to do, and the peak of his power is when he then declares himself to be God, which is ironic because you would think that a man who thinks so highly of himself, who thinks himself to be God, would do it when he is still winning, not when he seems to have suddenly lost. So it's ironic. In other words, the man of lawlessness does not declare himself to be God on the peak of his successes, but rather when he falters for a moment. He is humiliated, and this indicates that he is not without defeat. This man is not completely unstoppable. But rather, it is defeat which causes him to be furious. The motivation tied to his actions which follow, which includes war against Israel, are perfectly in keeping with the actions and motivations of his father, the devil. Because when does the dragon call up the sea or the beast from the sea? When does he begin his big master plan? When does he give all of his authority over? When he has been defeated in heaven, when he has been kicked out, when he has been thoroughly defeated and thrown down to the earth and is no longer able to go back up and accuse the brethren. That's when he activates his plan, and here we see the man of lawlessness doing the same thing. In the face of defeat is when he activates his big scheme. And we know that the urgency and the speed with which they do it is motivated because they know, at least the dragon, that the time is short. And so this man is not without flaw. He rules over a divided kingdom even at its peak. At no point do we ever see everyone perfectly in line with him. He is constantly spending his time beating people into submission, forcing people to worship him, and having to maintain that ego. He never really gains full control, but it gets even worse for this man. Because he rules over a divided kingdom, the clay mixed with the iron. It is a divided kingdom, and it never really unifies, not ultimately. And he will spend his time in the peak of his power subduing rebellions and oppositions. After he declares himself to be God in Daniel 11, the first thing he does is then go to war and begin warring against the saints and other nations. Worse than that, the very start of his most powerful period of reign is also the introduction of the day of the Lord, where the kingdom of the beast is beaten within an inch of its life and no one is able to enjoy the fruits of his success. In other words, as soon as he thinks he has achieved peak power, when everything seems to be in a line, God ruins everything and begins to rain down judgment from heaven in the forms of the seals and the trumpets. So there's the sixth seal and on, and then the seven trumpets and the bowls of wrath, and everyone who participates in his kingdom are suffering all the way through. And ironically, this man is the opposite of the one true Christ, who actually existed as God. I mean, you compare these two figures here. Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but humbled himself. He became a servant. He became crucified. He died for his enemies. He did not eradicate them. He had every right to. He had every ability to, but he didn't. He humbled himself by becoming obedient even to the point of death on a cross. He allowed himself to be humiliated, and he himself despised the shame or rejected the shame. It was a part of the process, and he drank the entire cup handed to him by the Father. You see humility, you see love, you see sacrifice when being reviled. He did not revile in return. And in fact, in that reference, in 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to compare two text here in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, describing Christ and comparing ourselves to Christ. He says this, "For you have been called for this purpose," in reference to the context of suffering, "since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps." Speaking of Christ now, "who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth." Where the man of lawlessness, the word deceit is described over and over again. Here we see Christ not having any deceit. "And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness, for by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have been returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." This is what Christ did. But here in this man, we see the opposite. We see a man who only ever speaks of his own greatness, of his own boasting. This man, all he does is talk great things, large things, expansive things. Any successes he has are added to his resume, and any potential defeat or humiliation he uses as the springboard into vengeance and wrath. He shows no patience. He shows no regard for anyone else. He magnifies himself above everybody and everything and every cause. He does not sacrifice himself for others. He sacrifices all others for himself. And we see an allusion to this man, and this is where we'll wind it down here. In Zechariah 11, there's an interesting reference here. It seems to be in passing. It's in an interesting context that this is given. Zechariah has been basically playing the part for the Israelites, referencing the flock that is doomed, speaking of Israelites and judgment and Lebanon and so on. And he puts on this apparel to kind of play the part like an actor. But all the way down towards the very end, in verse 15, "The Lord said to me, take again for yourself the equipment of a foolish shepherd. For behold, I am going to raise up a shepherd in the land," and this is referencing Israel, "who will not care for the perishing, seek the scattered, heal the broken, or sustain the one standing," which is what Christ did. Here, this foolish shepherd is not going to do that. "But he will devour the flesh of the fat sheep and tear off their hooves. He will use them. He will take advantage of them. He will see them as resources. Woe to that worthless shepherd who leaves the flock. A sword will be on his arm and on his right eye, and his arm will be totally withered, and his right eye will be blind." Now, whether that's metaphorical or it's actually describing what he's going to look like at this point, I do not know. Because, again, he's putting on this garb and he has a function. But one thing's for clear, there is an underlying tone here that this guy is going to be, in some form or another, physically handicapped. And so you see a foolish shepherd suddenly showing up. And the idea is that the Israelites, the flock, will fall prey to a foolish shepherd. They will follow after one who does not care for them, and he will lead them to their own destruction. And so it is in this way that it seems that the Israelites will initially fall for him. Maybe they think he's a messianic figure. Maybe they think he is the precursor to the Messiah. Maybe they think he's Elijah. It's hard to say exactly what their speculation will be. From Jewish eschatology, they believe, one, that Jesus was not the Christ. They don't think he was the Messiah. But they also don't think that the Messiah will be God. They think the Messiah will be a man. They think that this man will save them primarily from their enemies. At the time, they were wondering when Christ was going to deal with Rome. He didn't. That was severely disappointing, and they eventually crucified him. But here, even today, you see references to this as well. They're still wondering when their Messiah is going to come. And what they think will be the thing that ushers in their Messiah is the rebuilding of the temple. That's one of the reasons why they're so fixated on it. In their eschatology, they believe that God will only let them build a temple if they have found favor with God again. And some believe that the Messiah will either come as the temple is being rebuilt and will rebuild it, or some others believe he will come as soon as the temple is rebuilt. Either way, they tie the appearance of the Messiah to the temple. And you can see this man who leads them in, who potentially leads them to building a temple, and then sits in the temple and declares that he is the Messiah, and more importantly, that he is God. So you can kind of see where the theme of these things are going. And the way he will accomplish this, which we will get into next time, along with the reach of his authority and how he will rule the nations, the ways he will subject them, we'll get into next time. But one of them is theology. It's always kind of stood out to me why John, when he's talking about the Antichrist, speaks of him the way he does. Because he does not talk about world power, he doesn't talk about kings, he doesn't talk about any of those things. He talks about what we would call a theological exploit, either denying that Jesus was the Christ, in other words, saying there's still room, there's another one to come, or saying that, well, Jesus was, but he never actually came embodied. He was a spirit. It was the spirit of Jesus. So, there's still room now for another one to show up. And at the end of the day, they deny Jesus, ultimately. And so, to end, here is my speculation and my warning. Speculation, every eschatology believes that Christ is coming back. Virtually every eschatology that has anything to do with Christianity, with the Old Testament, believes in some way, other than the Jews, that Christ is coming back. The amillennialist view is that he will eventually appear for some reason, just to kind of end things, tie things up. Everything else is already done, so he'll pop up at some point. We're not really sure why, and I don't think they think that much about it. The postmillennialist believes that he will not come until we have subjected all the nations under him, at which point, once we've kind of subdued them, as one man said, it's not that there won't be Catholics, they just won't be in power anymore, we will. And so once we've done that, we've put all of his enemies as a footstool under his feet, then he'll come back. So even they believe he's coming back. We, as premillennialists, obviously have differing views on when the rapture happens, but all still believe Christ is coming back. Catholics, Mormons, Muslims, they all believe he comes back. The Catholics lean more to the idea that the church has replaced Israel and that Christ is coming back at some point following a trial of the church. Mormons are more resemble a premillennialist view, though they tie these events to North America and they tie Joseph Smith into it, and it's a bit bizarre. Muslims also believe that Jesus will actually come back first, clarify to everyone that he wasn't actually God. He will then go get married and then die. He will also, with another figure in their eschatology, fight back against their Antichrist who comes afterwards, claiming to be God. So you can see there's kind of a flip of our own. But no matter what, they all believe Christ is coming back. And so it's not a question of don't believe anyone who doesn't believe Christ is coming back. It's actually down to the theological specifics. And that's why in Matthew 24, the warning that he issues is fascinating to me. What does Jesus say will come? False Christ. Many will come saying, I am he. See, our eschatology is fulfilled. What if, hypothetically, amillennialists think their eschatology is fulfilled? I mean, their theology is probably pretty bad if they believe that, but for the sake of argument, a guy shows up and they say, there he is. The postmillennialists, we have a guy who has now subjected the nations, and we think he subjected them under Christ. Now he says he is Christ. Premillennialists, they get their timing wrong, and they think, the Great Tribulation's already happened. Maybe it was all spiritual. Maybe it was all metaphorical. Guy showed up. Now he says he's Christ. And then the Mormons, the Muslims, the Catholics all have theirs. In other words, it's not that one of the eschatologies will be fulfilled. What if all of them appear to be? And so now you're playing a sort of theological shell game, trying to figure out which one you're actually supposed to be keeping track of. That it's not one guy will show up, it's not a dozen guys. False Christ will be everywhere, and so identifying which one is the man of lawlessness will become tricky at first, which is why he has to be revealed, per 2 Thessalonians. So there's the warning, but then Jesus says, don't let them deceive you. And I think in part, by consequence, what he's saying is that our eschatology actually really matters when we get down to the specifics. Yes, even the timing, even the character, because as we see, in the end, everyone will have to be forced to the conclusion about whether this man is the Christ or he's not. He will claim to be God, and most people will follow him. Most will, either by force or by will. It will happen. And so to end, 2 John, short section, I'll just read it here. 2 John chapter 1, the only chapter, in verse 7. He's issuing a warning. For many deceivers have already gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves, that you do not lose what we have accomplished, but that you may receive a full reward. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the actual teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. And note, again, the use of the word teaching. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, not some teaching, not some variation of it, the teaching of Christ, do not receive him into your house, and do not give him a greeting, for one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. Theological perversion will take place, and don't think the enemy isn't good at it. He's got 2,000 years of experience to pervert Christ in particular. And I'm convinced that that is coming because judgment begins where? In the church. And what's the thing that accompanies and precedes the revelation of the man of lawlessness? The apostasy, and the way he does that is through theology. Oddly enough, that's how he gets people to come in line. And then anyone who doesn't, he tries to force into it. So a lot more to say on this. We've kind of barely scratched the surface of this character, and I want to kind of get moving into the rest of the text, but there's a lot to this and a lot more to say on it. So obviously stuff in the news, interesting, but we got to keep ourselves regulated to what it says. Some of it seems oddly familiar, but be careful when dabbling in this subject, because as I've been warning here, I think some people will think that's good enough and then run with it. And now they're ready to fall prey to a false appearance of Christ. There will be many second comings, but only one real one. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the glimpse that we get to have into what's coming, into the nature and even the specifics of what's coming. But I thank you that we have such a clear contrast to this, that we have a figurehead, a king that we follow who is not boastful, even though he would have every right to be, and that is not empty in his words or claims and does not suffer defeat. That we have someone who is not only great, but humbled himself for us. I thank you that we get to look at this, that we get to glimpse this, we get these contrasts, and that even in this bleak idea of the future, we get to have such clear assurances of what is awaiting us on the other side, and that this man is already defeated. We thank you for these things and this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.